While the Senate debates the future of Judge Brett Kavanaugh's Supreme Court nomination, the House of Representatives have been busy passing 3 bills, including Tax Reform 2.0, making last year's GOP tax cuts permanent. The House passing 2 of those bills yesterday, the final larger bill being passed today in a vote largely along party lines. With me now to discuss, Mattie Duppler, senior fellow at the National Taxpayer Union. Mattie, I got to tell you, this is I was reading today of all those things that are going on here, and some of it bipartisan,
right.
But we haven't seen it in a long time. For instance, the Pentagon's first on-time annual funding bill in 22 years.
Right.
Health and Human Services, the first time that they've seen their funding for their committee, their office, in 20 years. What do you make of it? Is this some sort of great sign of things to come?
I think it just indicates, again, that whenever you hear a pessimistic headline, there are good things happening here in Washington. So a lot of fiscal news this week. You mentioned, of course, that the government is going to stay open for the first time in a couple of decades. We won't have a CR governing how we fund the government. That's huge. That shows that there's actual process reforms that are happening that makes politicians come to the table and make some difficult choices. But you mentioned earlier the tax reform bills making their way through the House of Representatives is truly an important move. One, because it actually shows the vision for the future that Republicans are putting forth when it comes to fiscal policy. But two, you mentioned that before, it was actually bipartisan. So for all of the acrimony that we've heard over the Tax Cut and Jobs Act that you and I know, Charles, has increased the ability of American businesses to be competitive, Democrats now are starting to get on board. They voted in favor of the 2 bills that the House brought up yesterday that had to do with savings and increasing opportunities for entrepreneurs. And then today, when the vote was on the bill that would allow for the individual side of the tax code to be made permanent, we had 3 Democrats who decided to vote with Republicans in favor of that legislation. And I anticipate that that will start, that's the beginning of more Democrats coming around on what the Tax Cut and Jobs Act did for the individual taxpayer.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's really a tough one with all of this economic success to be a Democrat and say I didn't vote for it. Like, I know you've got a job you didn't have a year ago. I know you're making more money you didn't make a year ago. I know your house is worth more than it was a year ago, and I voted against it. That's pretty embarrassing. They don't want that to happen again, I can imagine.
Yeah, it's exactly right. And look at the people who are voting in favor of this bill. You had Kristen Sinema and Jackie Rosen, people who are running in competitive Senate races. So I think that indicates that statewide, when people are talking about the good economic circumstances that their voters are experiencing, they want to be able to say that they can take credit for it. Democrats, of course, are going to have a hard time doing that. Remember, the only reason we needed to take a vote to make the individual side permanent is because Senate Democrats refused to vote in favor of tax reform last year. That means that Senate rules required some of these provisions to be made temporary. That's why the House of Representatives took out that legislation this week to once again make the case to the American people for what pro-growth tax code changes look like.
We got less than they're giving me a rap signal. I was going to ask you about the sword of Damocles, the deficit, but the debt. We'll talk again real soon because it's only going to get larger next time we talk.
Exactly. We need to work on that spending problem now.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I want to switch gears now to our weekly installment of American Success. Kelly Peeler, a millennial dynamo, she has caught the attention of Forbes, Fast Money, Goldman Sachs, and the White House. After graduating from Harvard,